relaxing thing that I get to do, probably like a lot of you, is to go on a date with my wife. Nothing is more relaxing. Very few things are more fulfilling than spending time with that great lady. After all that I shared in session 2 about my dad and his addiction and how it tore our family apart, and how that came home to roost for me as an adult man, in the midst of pastoring a church, in the midst of doctoral studies, in the midst of parenting 3 girls, in the midst of trying to be an adequate husband to my wife, I began to stuff all that. I thought I knew what to do with it, and I didn't really know what to do with it. A lot of emotions, a lot of disappointment, a lot of anger, a lot of sideways thoughts, a lot of things that I thought that I felt ashamed that I would even think them. And a lot of things I wanted to say. Some things I did say, and some things I kind of regret saying. But a lot was on the soul, and I kept pushing it down and pushing it down. And a couple years out from that revelation of my father's failure, I went to the movies on a date night right here in our hometown. Made my way over to the movie theater, sat down. I was watching Kevin James, Here Comes the Boom. Good movie. Funny movie. I wouldn't know what it was that night, though. I sat down and I was sitting next to my wife, and the movie started, and my heart started to race. And I started to sweat. And I started to have shortness of breath. And all of a sudden, I started to feel a pain in my shoulder. And now when you start to put all that together as a man, the first thing you begin to think is, I'm having a heart attack. And I leaned over to her and I said, sweetheart, I don't feel well. She said, you're going to be okay. She knew I was battling with anxiety. You'll be okay. I said, okay, I'll be okay. Kept watching the movie. 10 minutes in, it's not getting any better. 10 minutes in, the pain starts to move to my chest. 10 minutes in, my breathing is even shorter. 10 minutes in, I'm starting to squirm into my seat, and I'm trying to be strong for my wife, because that's what we're supposed to do as men. And the last thing I want is her to be nervous about me. And I leaned over, though, and I said, I am really not feeling well. You going to be okay? I don't know. Do you need to go? No, I think I'll be okay. I think I'll be okay. Last thing I want to do is leave a movie with my wife. 5 minutes later, I'm not okay. And she said, do you need to go? I said, I need to go. We stood up. We walked down the stairs. I walked out. And as soon as I hit the foyer, the last thing I remember seeing was the door, and I hit the floor. My wife was scared to death. She thought I was dying. She started smacking me in the face. I came to as she's sprapping me in the face. And the EMTs were already on their way for the local pastor who passed out in the foyer of the movie theater just a mile from his church. And they came and they tended to me, and I looked like a circus show in that foyer. We ended up going to the hospital. I was fine, sort of. Physically, I was fine. Emotionally, I was destitute. Spiritually, I was a mess. Psychologically, I felt like I was falling apart. And I was a couple years out in dealing with this stuff. But not really. I just had stuffed it. And you might recall that when you stuff it, what happens? It comes out sideways. We got to think about how we go into our bags as men, stuff in the past, and how we get back in there and how we rummage around and how we look at the stuff we don't want to look at and how we do something with it, how we identify what it is, how we call it something, how we figure out how to deal with it and how to engage it. And so in session 3, we're going to talk about unpacking as men. Unpacking. On our journey as men, We already talked about understanding the present in session 1, sort of the lay of the landscape of manhood today. We're going to, when we get in future sessions, 5 through 10, we're going to talk about how we envision the future. But in sessions 2 through 4, the middle one of which is where we are right now as we think about unpacking, we've got to kind of have the courage to look at our past. We have to have the courage to get back into that a little bit and to maybe begin to assess some things, maybe begin to strategize, maybe begin to see a little clearly stuff in our own lives. You've got to be thinking about your stuff as we work through this together. There are 2 action steps for addressing our past. First one is that we have to be able to look back. We spent time in session 2 thinking about that, taking time to tell each other our stories. Hopefully you were able to do that last week. Connect the dots between our past and our present. We need to be able to make better sense of why we are where we are in our lives. The American poet laureate Stanley Kunitz wrote a poem. I'm going to risk reading a bunch of men a poem. All right? It's called The Layers. Listen close. I've walked through many lives, some of them my own, and I'm not who I was. Though some principle of being abides from which I struggle not to stray. When I look behind, as I'm compelled to look before I can gather strength to proceed on my journey, I see the milestones dwindling toward the horizon. In other words, I'm getting old. And the slow fires trailing from the abandoned campsites, over which scavenger angels wheel on heavy wings. Oh, I've made myself a tribe out of my true affections, and my tribe is scattered. How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? How am I going to deal with all the things that I left behind? In a rising wind, the manic dust of my friends, those who fell along the way, bitterly stings my face. Yet I turn, exalting somewhat with my will intact to go wherever I need to go. And every stone on the road precious to me. In my darkest night, when the moon was covered, and I roamed through wreckage, a nimbus clouded voice directed me. And here's the quote. Live in the layers, not the litter. Though I lack the art to decipher it, no doubt the next chapter in my book of transformations is already written. I'm not done with my changes. What on earth could it possibly mean to live in the layers and not in the litter? What does he mean? When I think of this, I think about a landfill. What you do with your trash. You bury it. But you bury it in particular layers. You deal with it in particular layers. And as you put it in those particular layers, you do it so you minimize pollution that comes from that. See, all of our lives, my life is filled with litter. I've got some great stuff in my past. And I've got some litter, but litter is scattered. It doesn't make any sense. It's random. I look at litter on the ground and I can't make coherent sense of it. Why does this sit here and this sit here and this sit here? But if you bring it together and you're purposeful with it, you can do something to keep it from polluting you as you move forward in your life. You have to be willing to look back and examine the past. There's a second action step for addressing the past. And that's where we're going to spend our time. Unpacking. It's where you engage. Not just examine, not just assess and know what it is, but you engage your trouble spots. I don't live in the same house I used to live in our local community. Instead, I lived in a house for a number of years. We built the house, and as part of the package, we had our front yard put in, but we didn't have our backyard put in. And as you'll find out, probably from other stories I share, I am of very little use around the house with my hands. And we didn't put it in the backyard, and it was a big mistake, but we had limited resources. We'd relocated to plant a church. We were on financial support. We were limited in what we could do. We stretched ourselves already to be able to get in the home. So I had one of the larger lots in our neighborhood, and it was all mud, and it was all dirt, and it was all a mess, and it was a disaster. A disaster. I hired a guy to put in a sprinkler system, and he did me dirty and charged me, even though the job didn't really get complete the way I wanted. And I was left really financially strapped. I used to look at that yard, and it was like a statement on my life. I used to look at that yard. I hated that yard. I thought of that yard like Bill Murray thought of Gophers in Caddyshack. I just wanted to blow up the yard. Couldn't stand it. And it was screamed at me every time. You're no good around the house, and you don't make enough money. Not enough resources. Not enough know-how to get it done. I never got the yard in. And I'll tell you what happened after months, years. I looked at that yard, and my will to do anything in that yard was in the tank. I didn't want to do anything with the yard. I hated the yard. I didn't even like going out my back door, hardly, to see that yard as a reminder of my inability to address the situation and my will. I really feel, guys, like that's a lot of men in their past. They look at their past and they go, I don't know the first thing to do about it. I don't know what to do. I don't have the resources. I'm just trying to make it, man. I don't have the resources to go back there and look at that. That's all good. You pull out and find that stuff and see all my litter and try to figure out how to layer it, and you can tell me that wonderful story. But I don't have the resources, and now my will is kind of down. My hope is through our time in this session that you'll begin to have the will to address some of your trouble spots. What's a trouble spot? Well, a trouble spot can be defined as any unresolved issue from the past where a lack of closure, a lack of getting something done adversely impacts and shapes the direction and dynamics of a man's life now. Listen, guys, if you can close up those unresolved things, what it does for your life. Get this. We sold the house and we moved into a great place. In fact, a friend of mine made a joke once. He's in the room. And a friend of mine made a joke that finally when I moved in to my new house, there was a yard small enough that even I could take care of it. Not appreciated, by the way. Guess who bought the house? A Finnish carpenter with an amazing skill set. We got a piece of mail delivered a year later to the wrong address, to our old address. I had to go pick it up. And you want a wound of the manhood. I walked back in that guy's backyard, and he did everything and more that I ever dreamt of doing. It was unbelievable because he knew how to do it, and he had the resources to do it. See, there's something about knowing, and there's something about having the resources that give you the impetus to do something and to get it done. But if you don't close off some of those areas of your past and let closure come to those trouble spots. I mean, it's like an action film where people get in a gunfight on a plane, which is just dumb, but they get in a gunfight on a plane and a hole blows through the wall of the plane. And then what happens? Hole gets bigger, hole gets bigger, hole gets bigger. People get sucked out. This is what happens in our lives. The hole doesn't close by itself. The further on you go, the bigger it gets and the more people it wounds. A trouble spot. We've got to be able to address them. So let's think about some common trouble spots that undercut our manhood. Some common trouble spots that undercut our manhood. Number one, and you can fill these in your workbooks as we go, the dad wound. Now, I've heard people, the minute you bring this up, they begin to think, yeah, the father wound. There's all kinds of books written about the father wound. They get cynical a little bit, and not every dad wounds his kids, and I don't disagree that not every dad wounds his kids. But I will tell you, in 25 years of pastoral ministry, an inordinate amount of men walk around with gaping wounds that they have put so much makeup on, they would put Mary Kay out of business with. And they're largely from their fathers. Oftentimes, the people who are the most vociferous, the loudest in denying any woundedness are the ones who are carrying the most. They just don't seem to quite grasp it. Now, it doesn't mean everybody. Some of you grew up with a great dad. Praise God that you did. What a wonderful thing. But listen, it's impossible to overstate the impact of a dad on a son's life. Impossible. Whatever your dad was like, positive, negative, you did not leave him behind. You didn't. I tell couples when they're getting married, you're coming together and you need to know that this new marriage thing that you're forming, this covenant bond, is in many ways going to be a narrative, a new story. But it's like these tributaries coming in and forming this new river. And you're bringing everything with you from the previous home that you had. That includes the relational contours of what your life with your father was. For me, growing up, I've shared with you, my dad was a great dad early on. My wife will thank my father still, even amidst all the junk, for how he was to me when I was younger, because it set the trajectory for me to engage her with some sensibility when we got married. I'm dealing with a different kind of baggage. Some of you guys are dealing with that, but some of you are dealing with baggage that goes back to when you were young. A lot of the hurt in men's lives today comes from the absent dad. Dad wasn't around. There's a quote that I love from Frederick Buechner. It's a hard quote. Frederick Buechner was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a little book he wrote, Godric. But Buechner said this: if strangers and strange sights can shake the world of children, it takes the people they know and love the best to pull it out from under them like a chair. Kids can get rattled. Kids can get frightened. Kids get easily scared. Take a little kid out, Halloween time. And it's all fun when you see Goofy, and it's cute when you see a princess, and then some teenage nut job comes up with one of those scream masks, and your little 4-year-old's about ready to wet his pants. Right? That's scary. That's scary, and he'll get over it. But he won't get over an absent dad. He won't get over a dad that pulls the rug out. He won't get over a dad that moves the chair, causing him to fall. Everclear, and this is in your notebooks, Everclear, lyrics to a song called Father of Mine. It says, Daddy gave me a name and then he walked away. I'll never be safe, I'll never be sane. I will always be weird inside. I'll always be lame. Daddy gave me a name. Then he walked away. Daddy gave me a name. And then he walked away. See, an absent dad, though, doesn't just cause problems for Junior. An absent dad doesn't just cause problems for his daughter. An absent dad, he has another issue. An absent dad often brings on another trouble. Too much mom. Too much mom. And I got to tell you, men, there are a lot of single mothers who are knocking themselves out. They're picking up the slack of a lot of absent dads. They're trying to sometimes be a father figure. They weren't made for it. If they're not trying to be one, they're trying to find one. They look in churches. They look for some remnant of a man with a sense of manhood that maybe could come along and help their child. They feel the weight of supplementing an absent dad. But here's the thing. That usually results in a kind of over-aggression on mom's part. It results in a kind of dominance. It results in a kind of, I've got to be in control because there's no one else for me to lean on. I'm solo in this context. And that's a hard place for a lady to be. She wasn't made to be in that place. Some of you may have been raised by a single mom, and you know that, and you experience that. And it tends to foster one of two errors, right? Mom's trying. But sometimes it can foster a child that replicates that kind of dominance in a way and tries to control things, lays hold of things too aggressively, or it can foster a kind of weird codependence with mom and their child, particularly a mom and a son. Too much mom causes a problem in a lot of homes and a lot of generations and a lot of going down the line are impacted by this, because then that guy, if he hasn't dealt with what's in his bags, if he hasn't unpacked them, if he hasn't come to something like Betterman to begin to address them, he might become a parent. And he's going to begin that process of passing that down along the way. Secondly, a lack of a clear manhood vision. The lack of a clear manhood vision. Manhood is not something you should just know. We're insecure. We're insecure. I know for some guys, talking about and being taught what manhood is feels almost juvenile. You almost want to say, I'm above that. I don't need that in some way. It exposes things, but it's not just the kind of thing you should know. I mean, if nobody teaches you how to do stuff around the house, you're not just gonna know it. If nobody teaches you how to read a book effectively, you won't know how to do it. If nobody teaches you how to be a mechanic, how to fix a car, how to change a tire, you won't know how to do it. Let me get real vulnerable in a way that I hate, but I'll do it anyway. I'm not good around the house. I've mentioned that. Here's one of the most humiliating things my wife, and she does, bless her heart, she's not trying to humiliate me. She's not. She's trying to help me. But I have an ego, right? And because I have an ego, I get easily humiliated. Now, my mother-in-law is a great lady, and she is really good around the house. And I'm not talking about sweeping floors. I'm talking about turning wrenches, using hammers and saws. She's real good, and she knows stuff. Help build a log cabin. Okay? So when something's going wrong around the house, here's a statement that's happened before. Are you ready? Hey, Brian, just call my mom and ask her how to do it. Sweetheart, you mean it? I could call your mom and I could ask her how to hang the curtain rod? How humiliating. Ask my mom? I was just counseling a young guy. He's in a dating relationship. His dad didn't teach him how to date. His dad didn't teach him what a man looks like effectively. So he's run into some issues in his dating relationship. So I've been working with him. I've been talking to him. I've been helping him. And as I talk with him, as I work with him, as I help him, one of the things I tell him is this: tell that wonderful girl that you're with that you're not all there yet, but you are learning how to be a man, how to do this. And she has one role right now, and that is to be patient with a man who's learning how to be a man and learning how to try, right? You got to have space to not know. Space to not know. Manhood is not something that just happens. Why is that the case? It's not something that just happens. The reason is because, as we mentioned in previous session, you're going uphill, right? The great theologian Bob Seger, 1980, released a song, Against the Wind, right? He had 3 verses in it. The first verse, it's all about him shacking up with the queen of my nights, he calls her, Janie. I don't know who she was, but Bob loved her. Then the next verse is about how he's left all that behind and he's just a drifter, floating around, kind of going nowhere fast, and he begins to realize it. And then the third verse is real short, and he's in the third stage of his life, and he says, all I got is deadlines and commitments, deadlines and commitments, deadlines and commitments. And what's the common theme that runs through all of it? What's the chorus? Against the wind. He's always running against the wind. You are always going against it. Always. Against culture, against your own sin, against your past, against sin in your family, against bad things that you have inherited, things that are going to trip you up. It's not something that just happens. That's why real manhood is taught. It's a learned lifestyle. You see it modeled in men. You hear it talked about by men. You receive skills from men to practice and apply it. Listen, if you don't get this, it's going to be the kind of thing that's a trouble spot for you. It's going to hold you up. It's going to keep you from it. Now, all of this, though, presupposes, if manhood is taught, guess what it presupposes? That you're the kind of person that can be taught. Because I know a lot of unteachable guys. I even know guys who act real humble. Like, they'll sort of like acknowledge they don't know, but they don't want to get off a dime because they're humble, but they're stubborn. Humility doesn't equal teachability. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 12:15, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. A wise man knows, listen closely, a wise man knows when he comes up against another man who knows better. You get better when you listen to somebody who knows better. Every 6 years, I get a 3-month sabbatical. Last sabbatical, I decided to map out the barbecue trail. The barbecue trail. We were driving across the country, and I wanted to hit the best barbecue places I could hit. The first one we went to was one that Anthony Bourdain, the late food critic and globe traveler, said was one of the 10 places to eat before you died in the world. And it's called Joe's in Kansas City. Used to be called Oklahoma Joe's, but Joe's in Kansas City. Got to go to the old convenience store location. So I got my family, we walk into Joe's. I walk in, and I come to the counter, and it was a Monday, I still remember. And its sign said, burnt end Mondays. And I thought, I'm having me some burnt ends on a Monday. And I thought, I'll get brisket. That's safe. I'll get brisket. That'll be good. So I go up to the counter. I look at the guy behind the counter. It's evident he's worked there a long time. I said, I'm going to get burnt ends and I'll get some brisket. He goes, no, you're not. Wife, kids are with me. I said, actually, I'm thinking, dude, I'm paying. Like, I'm going to get what I want. I said, yeah, I am. He said, no, you're not. I said, yeah, I am. He said, no, you're not. I said, I'm not. He said, you're not. I said, what am I getting? He said, you're going to get the burnt ends. That's a good call. He said, but you're not getting the brisket. You're going to get the ribs. And I said, I'm not a big rib guy. It's just not it's just not my jam. I'm not getting the ribs. He said, you're getting the ribs. I'm not getting the ribs. He said, you're getting the ribs. I said, I am? I said, all right. I'm getting the ribs. I get the ribs. I get the burnt ends. I walk back. I sit down. As God is my witness, I grabbed those ribs, and I could cry. I took a bite of those ribs. And I mean to tell you, I immediately looked over at my wife, and I said, sweetheart, it's a really good thing I'm sitting down because I would have collapsed. I can't imagine so much culinary joy this side of eternity. It was unreal. That man knew, and he picked me out a mile away. He knew I didn't know jack diddly squat about what I was doing, even though I wanted to act like it. And man, was I glad I listened. Listen, whoever heeds instruction is on the path to life, but he who rejects reproof leads others astray. See, here's the thing. It's one thing if you order the wrong food. But if you don't listen to wise people, if you don't listen to better men, you can leave a train of traumatic destruction behind you with other people. You can lead others astray. You need to take heed. There's a third trouble spot that undercuts our manhood, and it's unprocessed trauma. Unprocessed trauma. Now, this may or may not be related to Dad, but you've just taken on water. We all take on water. We take on a lot. Sometimes it's in little pieces, and sometimes it's big. Sometimes we take on little bits, and sometimes it's mammoth. Sometimes it's a deluge in different scenarios and situations. I had a stretch, my friends, of about 5 or 6 years where I just couldn't conceive I could take on much more water. I couldn't take on, after my father's collapse, it was within about a 6-year stretch. I dealt with betrayal. I dealt with burying a relative over a drug overdose. I dealt with finding my sister-in-law dead on her bed and trying to bring her back. Like, I thought, I don't know that I can handle much more in this life. And here's what happens. All of us have metaphorically a kind of emotional cup that kind of sits within us. And it's different sized. Like some of you can handle more trauma. Some of you can handle more difficulty. But it's limited. It's not infinite. You take on stuff. Usually what you take on, by the way, the first thing that goes in is hurt. It's usually the first thing. We don't want to talk it like that because it's more manly if we talk like we're angry. But anger is just a way that we describe calcified hurt. Anger is just hurt you haven't dealt with yet. But what happens is you get hurt. Somebody wounds you. An event happens, and it's like the game Battleship, and the event happens, and boom. C2. You hit my battleship. You take on enough, and it starts feeling like it's going to sink. And it hits you, and then if you don't deal with it, if you don't empty it out, if you don't process it, anger comes. If you don't deal with it in anger, here's what happens. It gets scary then. Resentment starts to come. If you don't deal with it at resentment, bitterness starts to come. If you don't deal with it at bitterness, contempt will come. See, contempt is when you're so angry, you don't care who you hurt in your anger. Contempt comes. And then contempt lasts long enough, and you get cynicism. And then you start to figure out something ain't right with me. Something ain't right in the basement. I got to go down. I got to see. And when you see it, you can get freaked out. And what happens when you get freaked out is you start trying to figure out how you can cope in your life with all that is in your emotional cup. And you get to number 4. You get to the next trouble spot. And that is that you try to cope, and when you try to cope, addictive habits begin to emerge. Oftentimes we can think of addictive habits in terms of the big 3. There certainly are more. But we say the big 3 because, man, have they left a legacy of destruction. The chances are some of you in here grew up with an alcoholic father, and you know all too well what that did. Some of you may have grown up with drugs. Some of you were introduced in the home to pornography. So pornography does some things. Neuroscience studies are beginning to catch up here and teach us some things about what pornography actually does in the rewiring of our brains. One of the things it does is it desensitizes us, right? It triggers things, dopamine and so forth in us, and it desensitizes us so we want more, but then we have to ramp up. We want more, we have to ramp up. We want more, we have to ramp up. We want more, we have to ramp up. And we continue that dance. What happens then is it begins to actually damage your brain. Let me read you something from Neuroscience News. Came out just a few years ago. Porn use has been correlated with the erosion of the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain that houses executive functions like morality, willpower, and impulse control. Pornography viewers are increasingly choosing more violent forms of pornography. This may be attributed to the desensitizing effect of regular consumption. The article goes on and says, damage to the prefrontal cortex in adulthood is termed hypofrontality, which predisposes an individual to behave compulsively and make poor decisions. At the end of this article, after it's talked about the deleterious effects of pornography, summarizes this. It's somewhat paradoxical that adult entertainment may revert our brain wiring to a more juvenile state. The much greater irony is that while porn promises to satisfy and provide sexual gratification, it delivers the exact opposite. Proverbs 25:28, like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. Sometimes that trouble starts in early life. The trouble comes with a big lie, and it goes like this: I can handle it. You can't. You can't. Take it from someone who lives. I could say lived, but that's not sufficient. Who lives in the shrapnel of that grenade when the pin gets pulled on addiction. Because guess who's no longer in charge? The addict. There's no such thing as an addict who's in charge of his addiction. It wouldn't be called an addiction if that was the case. And here's what happens with addiction. There's one place addiction will grow like wildfire. One place. And that's in secret. In secret. There's just no way in a room that we're in that there aren't people, men, who have addictions in secret. And I need you to know that that will destroy you. And it will render impotent any hope you have of having a legacy effect on people around you as a man. Our fifth problem comes right out of this. See, when you wall yourself off, no close friends. And there can be different reasons for that. Sometimes people don't know how to build relationships well. The biggest reason as men is that we all have guarded areas we don't want to let people into and see areas that we're self-conscious about, where we feel a sense of impotency about. We don't want people to see that. We don't want to hang out our dirty laundry for everybody. Another reason is, as an old counseling friend of mine used to say, we're terminally unique. Nobody gets us. You don't know what I've been through, man. You'll never understand. Nobody gets me. You don't know what it's like to be me. That, by the way, are the dying words of an addict. You don't know what it's like to be me. Terminally unique. You'll be unique all the way down to your grave, while there's a bunch of better men that you could have connected with who would help keep you afloat, and then would help you learn how to swim, and then would help you learn how to walk, and then would help you learn how to run, and you just might fly by the time you're all done with it, if you would have the humility to listen and the wisdom to cultivate some relationships outside of yourself. But no close friends, that'll destroy you. Isolation is, at best, unhealthy, and at worst, it is deadly. Listen to this verse. Men memorize this verse. Proverbs 18:1, whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment. Two things that come from isolation. Seeks his own desire. He's selfish. He's selfish. He breaks out against all sound judgment. He lacks wisdom. He can't make good decisions. Isolation will destroy you if not addressed. Real manhood is a team sport, my friends. Two are better than one. Solomon tells us in Ecclesiastes, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Every man needs at least one close friend. There is a friend, Proverbs says in Proverbs 18:24, that sticks closer than a brother. Do you have one? Do you? You can get one. You don't get down in the mouth, pout about it. If you don't have one, you get one. You engage. You get around men. You open your life. I've got them and I've got one. All of that. And I need it all. I need it. Desperately, I've needed it. So do you. Finally, some guys have a problem. They just get spiritually stuck. Spiritually stuck. They don't know where to go. They say things like, why would a loving God let this happen? These people in my life, they betrayed me. Even as we talk about getting close friends, some of you are thinking, I tried that and that did not work. I trusted God and it didn't work. The people I saw who were supposed to teach me the gospel, who taught me how to live right, allegedly, they ended up being fakes. Boy, I wrestled with that in the shadow of things with my dad. I struggle with doubts about God. My church was a bad experience. There's always, it seems like, an offloading of responsibility. Listen, you have a narrative, guys. You got one. So do I. We have a saying at our church, it says, come as you are, but for heaven's sakes, don't stay that way. You got a narrative. You need to know it. You need to be aware of it. You need to unpack it. You need to identify things with it. But you don't need to be a slave to it. That's the only way you can stop being a slave to it. So how do you address your trouble spots? What do? The first thing we do is you have to look at these trouble spots and you got to name it. You got to name it. Look, if you don't identify cancer properly, it's going to kill you. You've got to see it for what it is and call it what it is. And if any of those trouble spots, if any of those problems or others come up in your life, you've got to call them what they are. You got to look back in that bag and say, that's what that thing is, and if I don't process that, it's going to destroy me. You've got to name it. Now, when you name it, you don't keep it to yourself. Now, I'm not telling you to go get a website called allmyproblems.com and put it out there, all right? But here's what I am saying. You better share it. You get that group of close friends, you share it. Share it. Proverbs 11:14. Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors there is safety. Proverbs 13:20. Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise. You get around people that can help you be a better man, but the companions of fools will suffer harm. You got to curate who you're sharing with. James 5:16. Therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you might be healed. That's going to take vulnerability. Remember my wife? I was so good-hearted. Talk to my mom. She can help you with that house project. We recently needed to help my father. We needed to help him as his body physically was breaking down a bit to retire and be able to have a place where he could retire and have some means about his life without dying on the vine. And as an only child, and as somebody who has had a lot of healing in my own relationship with my dad, and I credit my dad with some of that as well. But I thought, I need to help him. So where I grew up is in a pretty economically depressed area. And I thought, I think I can buy an investment property up there. And my father is the opposite of me. He's very handy with home projects and so forth. Been a maintenance man most of his life. I said, I think I can get an investment property, put him in one of the units as a maintenance guy. He can live there, subsist. I won't lose my shirt, and all will be well with the world. So we laid out 8 properties to fly back to my homestead in New York to look around and to see. All in this little area I grew up in, 3 different towns, all within about 10 miles of each other. We started looking around and everything. But here's the thing. My wife said, hey, Brian, my parents live 3 hours from there. We really should call them to come up and look at the houses with us. They're going to ask questions we're just not going to ask. They're going to see things we're not going to see. They built their own home, for crying out loud. Now, what's my first thought? I don't need help. That demon's got to die. He's just an ego monster. Those sweet people came up. They went through house upon house with us. They gave wise advice. They thought of looking at stuff I would have never thought of looking at. They thought of questions I never would have thought of. You got to share it because you got to get different perspectives. But if you're an egomaniac and you keep it to yourself, you're going to lose your shirt and maybe your family and maybe your life. You got to share it. And finally, you got to engage it. You got to engage it. Get a plan together. The trusted family members or friends are willing to support you and take action. We'll talk about some of these things moving forward to address these trouble spots. Call on God. He, according to Psalm 46:1, is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And men, do not run from what is hard. Do not run from what is hard. I'm a big college football fan, and that quote in your workbooks from Nick Saban, if you can't overcome hard, you're never going to have any great victories in your life. If hard stuff, hard things, hard people, hard anything, if that's what makes you stop, you're just not going to make it. Maybe one of the greatest running backs in history, some of you remember, sweetness, Walter Payton. Thighs are just huge. Got those big thighs because In the off season, a famous hill, and you can go online and read about it, but this famous hill, in fact, you can't even find it anymore. Development is there where the hill used to be. But this hill where he used to run in the off season to prepare. And he was quoted as saying, here's what I try to do in the off season. They asked him, how do you train? What do you try to do? And he said, I try to kill myself. Let me share something with you. Until you try to kill yourself, until you try to kill your flesh, you'll never be able to live. Until you try to kill all that stuff that's haunting you, you won't be able to live. Until you kill all the narrative back there that keeps trying to sink your battleship, you won't be able to live because it's always uphill. You're a running back going through the line. You generate, you go, and they come, and they come, and they come. And the onslaught will not stop, man. It will not stop. It will not stop. Neither can you. Don't quit. Don't quit.